My father wore a blazer to dinner like he was giving a toast. Instead, he read his will aloud, distributing his empire while skipping my name entirely. Beside me, my husband sat terrifyingly calm. Not one person gasped. I realized this was a calculated erasure before a massive secret detonated. What my father did not realize was that my husband held the exact proof to destroy him. I walked out without a word, ready to build my own table. My name is Aurora Mitchell. I am 36 years old, and for the vast majority of my life, I was meticulously groomed to be the velvet glove over my family's iron fist. I grew up in Larkridge, Ohio, an exclusive enclave of sprawling estates, manicured lawns, and private security patrols where the wealth was as quiet as it was ruthless. My family owned Mitchell Crest Communities. To the general public, we were the visionary architects of luxury living. We built the most exclusive gated neighborhoods and executed the most ambitious prime real estate redevelopments in the Midwest. To those unfortunate enough to know how the sausage was made behind closed doors, we were an empire built on rezoning bloodbaths, aggressive acquisitions, and tightly crafted non-disclosure agreements. My father, Franklin Mitchell, did not raise children. He acquired and managed strategic assets. In his mind, every single person was a line item on a balance sheet. If you were useful and generated a high return on his investment, you were indulged with sports cars, trust funds, and his rare, approving smiles. If you strayed even slightly from his intended trajectory, you were swiftly and brutally corrected until you realigned with his grand vision. Love, in the Mitchell household, was entirely indistinguishable from compliance. He measured loyalty in profit margins and absolute obedience. My mother, Celeste, was the consummate corporate wife. She was a woman who treated our home like a high-end museum, where nothing was ever permitted to be out of place or out of season. She spent her days ensuring the mahogany dining table shone with a flawless mirror finish, and her evenings making sure her words were perfectly measured for the country club set. Scandals, affairs, and failures were not discussed. They were buried deep beneath heavy linen tablecloths and drowned in expensive vintage gin. She possessed a terrifying ability to smile through anything, holding the fragile fabric of our pristine family image together with sheer, manicured force and a frightening level of denial. Then there was my older brother, Grant. Grant was the official heir apparent, the golden boy whose name would one day inevitably sit at the very top of the company letterhead. But everyone inside the soundproof glass walls of Mitchell Crest understood the unspoken truth. Grant had the strong jawline and the easy charisma for the glossy marketing brochures. But I had the teeth. I could dismantle a complex, 50-page zoning contract faster than our expensive external legal counsel. I saw the hidden liabilities, the environmental hazards, and the disastrous financial loopholes before the finance team even opened their spreadsheets. Grant was destined to be the face of the empire. But from the time I was a teenager, it was explicitly understood that I would be the spine keeping him upright. I was carefully raised to be my father's right hand. There was absolutely no room for error. I was sent to the exact right private preparatory schools, pushed into the exact right elite social circles, and taught to speak with the precise blend of superficial charm and underlying intimidation required of our class. A Mitchell does not live small. Aurora, my father would tell me over breakfast, cutting his steak with surgical precision. We do not apologize for taking up space, and we certainly do not let lesser people dictate our terms. You are a predator in a world of prey. Act like it. I was given a platinum cage and told to be eternally grateful for the shine. For a long time, I played the corporate game flawlessly. I joined the family firm right out of law school, taking a massive corner office on the 22nd floor with a commanding view of the city skyline we were actively reshaping. For over 5 years, I was the perfect soldier. But the cracks in my unwavering loyalty began to show during a highly publicized project my father enthusiastically branded as urban renewal. It was supposed to be a vibrant revitalization of a working-class neighborhood bordering the river. The public relations brochures featured beautiful watercolors of artisan coffee shops, boutique fitness studios, and luxury townhomes. The reality behind the curtain was a targeted, systematic campaign to force out legacy homeowners. We used incredibly aggressive legal pressure, weaponizing obscure municipal code violations to bury hardworking families in daily fines until they had no choice but to sell their generational land for pennies on the dollar. I sat in the main boardroom, the air conditioning blasting, holding a thick file containing the names of families who had lived in those modest brick homes for over 60 years. I looked across the polished oak table at my father, feeling a sickening knot form in my stomach. "We are bleeding these people dry, Dad," I said, keeping my voice low but unwavering. "This is not revitalization. It is an eviction by 1,000 paper cuts. We are going to face a massive public relations nightmare if the press ever looks closely at these acquisition tactics, to say nothing of the sheer ethical bankruptcy of the entire strategy." Franklin did not even blink. He calmly adjusted his silk tie, his face an unreadable mask, and looked at me with a chilling emptiness. "Ethics are a luxury for people who do not have to make payroll. Aurora," he stated coldly. "These people are sitting on dirt that is worth 10 times what their small minds can comprehend. We are doing them a favor by moving them along. Do not let ridiculous sentimentality cloud your business judgment. It makes you look incredibly weak, and I do not tolerate weakness." "I am looking at a 50% increase in litigation risks," I countered, refusing to back down under his heavy glare. "And I am telling you, as your lead risk management counsel, that this strategy will eventually blow up in our faces." "Then you will fix it," he replied simply, dismissing my valid concerns with a slight wave of his hand. "Because that is exactly what I pay you hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to do." That was the exact moment the spell finally broke. I realized with crystal clarity that I was not a respected partner in a family legacy. I was just the most expensive cleaner on his payroll, expected to wash the blood off his hands and make it look like civic progress. I formally resigned 3 days later. I did not just leave the company. I left his immediate sphere of influence entirely. I took a position as a land risk advisory lawyer for Harrogate Advisory, a boutique firm that actually cared about sustainable development and legal compliance. I took a significant pay cut, reducing my annual salary by 40%. But for the first time in my adult life, I could actually sleep soundly through the night without a heavy weight pressing on my chest. To the rest of the competitive corporate world, it looked like a standard, albeit surprising, career pivot. To Franklin Mitchell, it was soft treason. He viewed my departure as a profound personal insult, a direct and calculated defection to the enemy camp. He never explicitly cut me off financially then, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees whenever I walked into the family estate for our mandatory Sunday dinners. Despite the heavy, suffocating underlying tension, I maintained the fragile illusion of family. I dutifully showed up for Thanksgiving dinner. I bought my mother the extravagant designer birthday gifts she demanded. I secretly helped Grant untangle his messy personal finances, bailing him out of 2 disastrous offshore investments when he frantically begged me to keep it from our father. I truly believe that because we shared the same blood. I still had a secure, undeniable place in the family hierarchy. I thought my father's quiet anger was a temporary condition, a standard power play that would eventually run out of steam once he realized I was successful on my own terms. I foolishly believed that underneath the cutthroat businessman exterior, there was still a father who loved his daughter, even if he fundamentally did not understand her choices. I was profoundly, dangerously naive. I thought the foundation of our family was strong enough to withstand a professional disagreement over a single real estate development project. I had absolutely no idea that the foundation was already rotten to the core, held together entirely by my father's obsessive need for absolute control and my mother's terrifying complicity. And I certainly did not know that my tenuous, fragile position within the Mitchell family was about to be permanently destroyed. I thought I knew exactly how cold my father could be. I thought I had seen the absolute worst of his ruthless nature during those bitter boardroom battles. But I was entirely wrong. The real war had not even started yet. I was still living under the comforting delusion that I was safe. That was before I met the man who would tear the heavy velvet veil off our perfect family. That was before I met the man who would turn my father's quiet, simmering resentment into an all-out scorched earth war. I met Wes Holloway on a damp Tuesday morning in late October. Harrow Gate Advisory had sent me to assess the environmental and structural liabilities of an abandoned railway station on the edge of the city. It was a sprawling, cavernous structure of rusted iron and crumbling brick that a major developer was eager to bulldoze. I was carefully navigating the debris in a tailored wool suit and heels, scanning compliance reports on my tablet. When I first saw him, he was standing near a massive arched window, running a bare hand over the exposed masonry. He wore faded canvas work pants and a heavy flannel shirt, coated in a fine layer of plaster dust. This was Wes, the owner of Holloway Restoration. He was the specialized contractor hired by the city council to salvage whatever historical architectural elements could be saved before the wrecking balls inevitably arrived. He was a man who worked with his hands, moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace amidst the ruin. He did not say a single word when I approached. He just watched me with quiet, dark eyes, taking in my pristine corporate clothes and the heavy silver watch on my wrist. He looked very closely at the world before deciding if it was worth his breath to speak. "You are the risk assessor," he finally said. His voice was deep, carrying a rough, grounded cadence that had absolutely nothing to do with country clubs or executive boardrooms. "Aurora Mitchell," I replied, extending a hand over a pile of broken timber. He looked at my hand, then at my face. He took off his heavy leather work glove before shaking it. His grip was calloused, warm, and exceptionally firm. "Mitchell, as in Mitchell Crest Communities." I braced myself, usually. This was the exact moment people either tripped over themselves to flatter me, hoping for a lucrative introduction to my father, or they visibly shrank, intimidated by the sheer weight of the family empire. Wes did neither. "I work for Harrow Gate now," I clarified, though experience taught me that distinction rarely mattered to outsiders. Wes turned back to the window, tracing the mortar line of the brick. "Your father's company has been trying to get their hands on this parcel for 3 years. Men like Franklin Mitchell love to tear down buildings that have stood since 1918, rip out the history, and then sell the memory of this place back to the public as a glossy real estate brochure. They will probably call it Historic Station Lofts and charge $5,000 a month in rent." It was a blunt, unapologetic assessment. He did not care about my last name, nor was he trying to impress me. In fact, he seemed to view my legacy as a fundamental structural defect. I should have been fiercely defensive. Instead, I found myself intensely captivated. Over the next 6 weeks, our paths crossed constantly as the site evaluation dragged on. I found myself lingering in the dust and the cold drafts long after my liability reports were finalized, just to watch him work. There was a profound, undeniable integrity in the way Wes handled his business. He restored broken things. He did not destroy them for a quick, ruthless profit. The men I was supposed to marry, the ones carefully curated by my mother over the years, were ambitious hedge fund managers and aggressive corporate litigators. They spoke in loud, rapid sentences, always trying to dominate the physical space, relentlessly selling me on their net worth and their 5-year strategic plans. Wes was an entirely different species of man. He was firmly anchored to the earth. He did not need to prove his worth by tearing anyone else down. He possessed a quiet, steadfast kindness that made me feel genuinely safe, a sensation I had never once experienced among the men who fit the standard Mitchell profile. Our romance was not a fiery, chaotic explosion. It was the slow, undeniable warmth of finding solid ground after spending 36 years walking on meticulously polished ice. The true friction began the very moment I brought him home. I knew introducing a blue-collar restoration contractor into the Mitchell family estate would be a jarring collision of classes. But the reality was far more suffocating than I had anticipated. We sat in the formal living room, surrounded by imported silk drapes and antique French furniture. My father did not ask Wes about his passions, his successful business, or his intentions with me. He immediately treated the introduction like a hostile legal deposition. "So, Mr. Holloway," Franklin said, swirling a heavy crystal glass of scotch, "where did you complete your undergraduate studies?" It was a calculated first strike. In my father's ruthless world, your university was your pedigree. "I did not attend a university, sir," Wes answered easily, taking a relaxed sip of his water. "I started framing houses when I was 18 years old. I learned the trade, got my general contractor license at 24, and opened my own firm by 28. My mother, Celeste, offered a smile so tightly drawn it looked physically painful. How wonderfully industrious. It is always so fascinating to meet people who actually work with their hands. "Would you care for another appetizer?" Wes. Her politeness was a thick, suffocating sheet of ice, perfectly designed to freeze him out while maintaining total plausible deniability. Across the room, my brother Grant smirked, swirling the olive in his martini. He looked at me with an expression of deep, patronizing amusement, clearly interpreting this entire relationship as a delayed, pathetic teenage rebellion playing out 2 decades too late. To my family, Wes was not a person. He was a temporary, distasteful lapse in my usually impeccable judgment. But the underlying tension was not merely about class or lack of a degree. 2 months later, the buried truth finally surfaced. Wes and I were sitting in the cab of his truck, eating takeout on a rainy Tuesday evening, when he casually glanced at an old architectural blueprint I had left on the dashboard. He recognized the signature of a specific structural engineer. That was when he told me the secret. 8 years ago, Wes had been a subcontractor on a massive commercial plaza being built by Mitchell Crest. Midway through the chaotic project, he discovered that the primary contractor was substituting premium load-bearing steel for a cheaper, unapproved, and potentially dangerous alternative. When Wes flagged the critical issue, a senior vice president from Mitchell Crest, acting on my father's direct, explicit orders, handed Wes a falsified materials report and a corporate check for $50,000. He was told to sign the document and look the other way. Wes flatly refused the money, refused to sign the fraudulent paperwork, and walked off the job entirely. He reported the severe violation to the Municipal Building Authority. My father had to spend millions of dollars in bribes, fines, and legal maneuvering to bury the inquiry and keep the project moving. Franklin remembered Wes. He vividly remembered the young, stubborn contractor who could not be bought. My father's disdain for my relationship was masterfully disguised as deep parental concern. "He cannot provide the life you are accustomed to. Aurora," Franklin would say during our tense phone calls. "He operates on a fundamentally different intellectual and financial plane. I am only worried about your long-term security." It was a complete fabrication. Franklin despised Wes for 2 highly specific reasons. First, Wes belonged to the self-made working class, answering to absolutely no one. Second, and far more unforgivable, Wes was completely unafraid of the Mitchell name. He had looked directly at the ugly underbelly of the beast and walked away completely unbothered. When Wes proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in his workshop, sliding a vintage, understated gold band onto my finger, I said yes with absolute, unwavering certainty. When I called my family to announce our engagement, the response was deafeningly practical. There were no joyful congratulations. There were no toasts to our future. The family immediately transitioned into high-level crisis management mode. Within 48 hours, an unprompted corporate courier delivered a 70-page prenuptial agreement drafted by my father's most aggressive lead attorneys. It was a brutal, draconian document. It stipulated strict boundaries on separate property, severe limitations on my access to my own trust funds if I remained married to him, and a condescendingly placed sunset clause. Along with the heavy leather binder came a handwritten note from my father, suggesting I still had 6 months to rethink this catastrophic deviation from the plan before making a permanent mistake. We were married in a small, unpretentious ceremony at a public botanical garden. It cost less than what my mother typically spent on floral arrangements for her annual summer gala. Only my closest friends and Wes's restoration crew were in attendance. My family declined the invitation, citing a convenient, suddenly scheduled corporate retreat on the coast. I never signed the prenup. I sent the thick binder back to my father's executive office with a single bold line drawn straight through the signature page. I did not reject the legal document because I was blinded by romantic naivety or because I failed to understand asset protection. I rejected it because, for the absolute first time in my existence, I clearly saw what the paperwork truly represented. My father was not trying to protect my money from Wes. He was trying to protect his absolute authority over me. He wanted to control the parameters of my love life with the exact same merciless precision he used to control his corporate cash flow. By choosing Wes, and by choosing a life entirely outside the Mitchell financial ecosystem, I was committing the ultimate, unforgivable sin. I was proving that I could survive, and even thrive, without him. Exactly 3 months after our quiet wedding, my mobile phone lit up with a call from my mother. Her tone was unnervingly bright, entirely stripped of the icy disapproval that had defined our recent interactions. She insisted that the entire family wanted to host a proper, formal dinner to officially welcome Wes into the fold. For a brief, agonizingly naive moment, I allowed myself to believe the war was over. I thought the sheer reality of my marriage had finally worn down my father's iron resolve, forcing him to accept the new dynamic. We arrived at the family estate precisely at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening. The moment Wes parked his truck on the circular gravel driveway, an invisible weight settled over my shoulders. Stepping through the massive double oak doors, I immediately sensed that the atmosphere was wrong. The dining room was a masterpiece of orchestrated intimidation. The long mahogany table was set with the absolute best porcelain, the rare, gold-rimmed plates my mother reserved strictly for visiting politicians or major investors. Tall, unscented white tapers burned flawlessly in heavy silver candelabras. The seating arrangements were rigidly predetermined by stiff, embossed place cards. The wine, a heavily structured red that cost several $1,000s a bottle, was already decanted and breathing. It did not feel like a family gathering. It felt like an elegant, high-stakes tribunal. Then my father entered the room. He was wearing a tailored charcoal wool blazer over a crisp white shirt. My breath caught slightly in my throat. It was a minor, almost imperceptible detail to anyone else, but it sent a sharp, involuntary chill straight down my spine. Franklin Mitchell never wore a blazer to a family dinner in his own home. He wore cashmere sweaters or rolled up his sleeves. The blazer was his armor. It was his chosen uniform for hostile takeovers, brutal board meetings, and the systematic dismantling of his competitors. He was dressed for corporate slaughter. We took our assigned seats. My mother sat at the opposite end of the long table, her posture perfectly straight, a tight, practiced smile plastered across her face. My brother Grant sat directly across from me, his eyes firmly fixed on the polished wood surface. My younger sister, Delaney, who had flown in from New York, sat next to Grant. Her knuckles were stark white as she gripped the stem of her crystal wine glass. Nobody offered a casual greeting. Nobody asked Wes how his week had been. The silence was thick, oppressive, and heavy with unspoken dread. The private chef served the first course in complete, agonizing silence. The only sounds in the massive room were the faint clinking of expensive silverware against fine china and the crackle of the fireplace. The tension was pulled so tight I felt it vibrating in my teeth. Midway through the main course, my father deliberately placed his silver fork down. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his blazer and withdrew a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper folded neatly into quarters. He did not look at me. He did not look at Wes. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paper, adopting the exact detached cadence he used when presenting quarterly earnings to aggressive shareholders. He began to read. It was a comprehensive restructuring of the Mitchell family estate. He listed the assets with chilling precision. The primary residential compound, the sprawling vacation property on the lake, the heavily guarded voting shares of Mitchell Crest Communities, the diversified private equity funds, the generation-skipping trusts, and the massive life insurance policies. He distributed the empire line by line. 60% of the liquid assets and the primary properties were allocated to Grant. 40% of the trusts and the remaining real estate portfolios were designated for Delaney. He established complex new holding companies and outlined strict governance structures for the family foundation. He read for 4 unbroken minutes. My name did not appear on a single line. It was as if I had never been born. He was legally and financially erasing me from the bloodline right in front of my face. He reached the bottom of the page. He paused, letting the heavy silence fill the room, before reading the final, carefully drafted addendum. Due to recent, irreconcilable personal decisions, my father read, his voice perfectly even. Aurora has explicitly elected to depart from the governance standards and the established legacy of this family. Consequently, she is entirely severed from all current and future familial financial structures. I slowly looked around the table. The sudden, nauseating realization hit me harder than the financial disinheritance itself. They all knew. Grant still refused to look up from his untouched plate. His jaw clenched tight in cowardly submission. Delaney took a long, desperate swallow of her wine, tears shining in her eyes but her mouth firmly shut. My mother sat entirely frozen, a perfect statue of complicity, staring blankly at the floral centerpiece. They had been briefed. They had likely signed the supporting documents. This was not a sudden, erratic outburst from a bitter patriarch. This was a unanimous, highly coordinated family decision, bound together by their shared silence. My father finally folded the paper and placed it on the table. He looked directly at Wes. There was no fiery hatred in his eyes, only a cold, clinical disgust. He did not raise his voice or use profanity. He used the polite, sterilized language of a corporate executioner. "You must understand," Franklin said, his tone dripping with weaponized civility. "We are an institution. We operate on shared values and mutual compliance. You represent a household actively antagonistic to Mitchell values. This is simply a marriage that cannot, and will not, be sponsored by this patriarch or this family." He was waiting for the explosion. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to hurl my wine glass against the antique wallpaper. He wanted Wes to lose his temper and validate every terrible, classist assumption my father held about him. He wanted a chaotic scene so he could feel entirely justified in his cruelty. I felt my heart pounding violently against my ribs, but my mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who evaluated his own flesh and blood by their strategic utility, and I felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. I calmly placed my linen napkin on the table. I stood up, pushing my heavy chair back. Wes stood up instantly beside me, his large hand finding the small of my back, an anchor of solid, unwavering support in a room built entirely on quicksand. "Thank you for dinner, Mother," I said. My voice was completely steady, betraying absolutely zero emotion. "The lamb was exquisite." I did not wait for a response. I did not demand an explanation or hurl a dramatic final insult. I simply turned around and walked out of the dining room, our footsteps echoing loudly on the marble floor of the foyer. We walked out the massive front doors and into the cool, dark night. I maintained my rigid composure until we were inside the truck and driving down the long, winding private road away from the estate. The darkness of the cabin enveloped us. I stared blankly at the passing trees, my mind racing through the sheer, calculated brutality of what had just occurred. Wes kept his eyes on the road. The dashboard lights cast a faint, amber glow across his sharp features. We drove in silence for 15 minutes before he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, analytical, and completely devoid of panic. "He isn't just cutting you out of the will, Aurora," Wes said. I turned to look at him, my brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, he just read the entire disinheritance out loud to an audience?" Wes shook his head slowly, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You know how these people operate better than anyone. Men like your father do not do anything purely for the dramatic effect. They do it to build a defense. Think about the specific words he used. He did not say he was punishing you. He said you elected to depart from their governance standards." A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. "He is not acting out of anger," Wes continued, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "He is building a legal file. He staged that entire formal dinner to establish a documented timeline. He is creating an ironclad narrative to prove to a board, a judge, or the press that you voluntarily separated yourself from the family operations." I stared at the glowing digits on the digital clock on the dashboard, the numbers burning into my retinas. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Wes was absolutely right. The dinner was not a punishment. It was a preemptive strike. "He is isolating you," Wes concluded softly, pulling the truck onto the main highway. "He is systematically severing your ties and destroying your credibility from the inside out, so that whatever massive disaster is about to happen at Mitchell Crest, you will have absolutely no standing to challenge him when the walls finally cave in." I did not sleep a single second that night. I lay awake in the dark, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, completely consumed by the terrifying clarity of my husband's words. My father had not just kicked me out of the family. He was legally neutralizing me because he knew I was the only person smart enough to see the explosion coming. For the first 7 days following that dining room execution, I operated in a state of sustained, low-grade fever. I arrived at the Harrogate offices before the sun rose and stayed long past the janitorial shift. I signed thick stacks of compliance documents, mediated complex client disputes over zoning variances, and drafted hundreds of emails with a relentless, mechanical efficiency. My colleagues noticed the shift, giving me a wide berth as I practically vibrated with repressed energy. Outwardly, I was the picture of a hyper-competent corporate attorney handling millions of dollars in municipal negotiations. Inwardly, my brain was stuck on a devastating, repeating loop. I could not stop hearing the dry, methodical cadence of his voice. I kept seeing him adjust his glasses, reading the names of parcels, trusts, and portfolios, actively deleting my existence from the world he built. Syllable by syllable, I saw the folded watermarked paper. I heard the clink of silverware. It was not the loss of the money that haunted me. It was the surgical precision of the erasure, the absolute lack of hesitation in his voice when he turned his daughter into a ghost. The silence from my blood relatives in the aftermath was absolute and deafening. Nobody called to apologize. Nobody sent a cautious text message trying to explain or soften the blow. They did not even dare to acknowledge the profound humiliation that had transpired over the roasted lamb. That quiet was all the confirmation I needed. This was not the isolated wrath of a tyrannical patriarch acting on a whim. It was a unanimous verdict, ratified by the cowardly silence of my mother, my brother, and my sister. I decided right then exactly how I would respond. There would be no dramatic social media manifestos, no tearful phone calls demanding closure, and absolutely no angry ultimatums delivered through intermediaries. I simply stopped. I dropped the heavy, exhausting burden of trying to be the compliant daughter within a fundamentally broken system. I stopped checking my phone for messages that would never arrive. I let the bridge burn quietly, walking away without glancing back at the smoke. I let the pain freeze solid, turning an emotional wound into a tactical advantage. Instead of falling apart, I poured every ounce of that frozen anger into my new division at Harrogate Advisory. The firm's partners had officially placed me in charge of our responsible urban development portfolio for the very first time in my professional career. I was actively utilizing the ruthless analytical skills my father had drilled into me, but I was weaponizing them to protect vulnerable communities from men exactly like him. I tore apart predatory acquisition contracts meant to displace low-income neighborhoods in the historic district. I found the deeply buried legal clauses that massive developers use to evade public housing commitments and environmental cleanup mandates. I anticipated their aggressive litigation tactics weeks in advance. I knew every dirty trick, every loophole, and every pressure point in the corporate playbook, because I had been raised by the man who practically wrote it. My clients thought I was a brilliant strategist. The truth was, I was just anticipating my father's shadow. While I dismantled bad contracts during the day, Wes was quietly building something real. Using his accumulated life savings and a modest commercial loan from a local credit union, he purchased a massive, abandoned freight depot on the industrial edge of the city. It was a cavernous, derelict space of shattered skylights, oxidized iron beams, and decades of accumulated neglect. He did not care about the optics, the lack of prestige, or the zip code. He cared about the bones of the structure. He was pouring his resources into a foundation that could actually hold weight, unlike the fragile, image-obsessed mansions of my youth. Our lives rapidly morphed into a grueling, beautiful rhythm of shared labor. After I finished 10 hours of intense legal maneuvering at the firm, I would drive to the depot, trade my tailored wool skirts for heavy canvas coveralls, and grab a paint scraper. We spent our evenings removing layers of toxic lead paint and our weekends navigating the labyrinthine municipal permit offices, arguing with city planners over historical preservation codes. Late at night, long past midnight, we would sit side by side on the cold, unfinished cement floor, eating cheap takeout noodles under the harsh glare of a single halogen work light. The physical toll was immense. My muscles ached constantly. My hands were perpetually bruised, and there was always plaster dust in my hair. But sitting there in the cold with my husband, listening to the wind howl through the broken rafters, I felt a profound sense of ownership that a massive trust fund could never buy. We were constructing a life from the ground up, brick by heavy brick, and no one could ever take it away from us by reading a piece of paper. It was during a routine late-night background check for a completely unrelated client that the first real piece of the puzzle fell into my lap. I was running a complex search through the State Environmental Registry when a familiar corporate acronym flagged in the database. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I pulled the public filings. It was a subsidiary shell company directly linked to Mitchell Crest Communities. I leaned closer to my monitor, the blue light reflecting in the dark. Silent office, and started tracing the paper trail. I pulled land registry deeds, corporate tax filings, and municipal hazard reports. What I found made the blood roar in my ears. Mitchell Crest was actively shuffling massive, toxic environmental liabilities and heavily leveraged debts back and forth between a complex web of affiliated corporate entities. They were transferring ownership of highly contaminated industrial plots to shell companies with zero assets, effectively shielding the parent company from millions of dollars in mandated cleanup costs. They were playing a high-stakes shell game to hide a massive solvency and compliance issue. This was not just aggressive tax avoidance or standard corporate restructuring. This was a deliberate, highly illegal attempt to quarantine toxic assets and defraud the state. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the interconnected web of holding companies I had sketched on my legal pad. I did not take immediate action. I knew better than to strike before I had the entire arsenal. I needed more evidence, more undeniable proof before I showed my hand. But the lingering, sickening intuition I had felt since that formal dinner suddenly crystallized into hard, undeniable fact. The tribunal had never really been about my choice of husband. My father had cut me out because he knew the empire was cracking, and he needed me isolated before the fraud surfaced. If the state came knocking, he wanted me dismissed as nothing more than a bitter, disinherited daughter. He thought he had locked me out of the house. He did not realize I now held the blueprints to burn it down. The transformation of the derelict freight depot did not happen overnight, but the grueling process of bringing the massive structure back from the brink of collapse became our shared religion. The cavernous ground floor slowly evolved into Wes's expansive restoration workshop, a beautiful, chaotic sanctuary smelling strongly of fresh sawdust, sharp linseed oil, and salvaged architectural history. He designated the eastern wing of the lower level as an open community space, hosting weekend workshops on historical masonry preservation and giving local artisans a place to gather and share their trades free of charge. Far above the roar of the industrial planers and the hum of the community below, the second floor became our private sanctuary. We built a sprawling, open-concept loft right under the exposed, heavy steel trusses. We furnished the massive space entirely with discarded pieces Wes had lovingly restored to their former glory and rich, textured fabrics we found at local weekend flea markets. It was warm, vibrant, and undeniably ours. While Wes was busy bringing dead structures back to life with his bare hands, I was doing the exact same thing for municipal zoning policies. Word of my highly specific, ruthless expertise at Harrogate Advisory spread rapidly through the neighboring counties. Small-town mayors and independent city councils began retaining my consulting services when they desperately wanted to revitalize their fading downtown commercial districts without selling their souls to predatory corporate developers. I drafted ironclad zoning protections that shielded legacy homeowners from skyrocketing property taxes. I structured complex public and private partnerships that strictly mandated affordable housing quotas in exchange for lucrative commercial building permits. I became the premier legal architect for the exact type of ethical, community-first development my father had always casually dismissed as a financially unviable weakness. I was proving to the entire region, contract by airtight contract, that extreme profitability and basic human decency were not mutually exclusive concepts. Wes, entirely by accident, became the public, recognizable face of this growing movement. Using an outdated, heavily cracked mobile phone, he started recording short, unedited clips of his restoration process. He would slowly pan the camera over a shattered stained glass transom, then cut to the painstaking, delicate process of re-leading the colorful shards on his workbench. He spoke quietly into the microphone about the incredibly tight grain of old-growth heart pine, the specific firing temperature required for 19th century brick, and the invisible, back-breaking labor of the forgotten craftsmen who originally built the structures. He never used flashy digital editing or loud, obnoxious background music. He just offered his quiet, profound respect for the raw materials. To our absolute shock, those rough, unpolished videos caught fire across the internet. Tens of thousands of people began watching him meticulously strip toxic lead paint from century-old doors. They did not just see a skilled contractor, they saw a man who genuinely cared about preserving the soul of a place instead of bulldozing it for a quick profit. His quiet, steady authenticity struck a massive chord in a society completely exhausted by glossy, manufactured perfection. Our loft naturally became the vibrant, gravitational center for a completely new kind of family. We began hosting informal Friday night dinners in our sprawling upstairs space. There were no stiff, embossed place cards, no heavy silver candelabras, and absolutely no restrictive dress codes. We squeezed local tradespeople, young, idealistic architects, our elderly neighbors, and exhausted city planners around a massive, reclaimed oak dining table Wes had built from salvaged warehouse floorboards. We served massive, steaming pots of homemade stew, passed cheap, delicious bottles of red wine, and talked over one another with loud, joyous enthusiasm. The loft echoed with genuine, unrestrained laughter and heated, passionate debates about sustainable urban design late into the night. It was a chaotic, brilliant warmth that stood in absolute, intentional defiance to the sterile, terrifyingly silent dining room of the Mitchell family estate. I had been permanently banished from my father's table, so I simply went out and built a larger, far more welcoming one. I knew, through the quiet, persistent whispers of the local real estate industry, that Franklin was watching my every move. He had undoubtedly calculated that my defiant exit would last exactly 6 months. He firmly believed I would drain my personal savings, grow exhausted by the grueling, unglamorous reality of a blue-collar marriage, and eventually crawl back to his polished glass towers, begging for my trust fund and my corner office. My sheer, undeniable success was the one variable his rigid, arrogant financial models could never predict. I was not just surviving, I was actively thriving in the exact professional sector he had spent decades trying to monopolize. Worse still, I was building a pristine, unassailable professional reputation by directly and publicly opposing his scorched earth methodology. But the dark gravity of my past was not completely done with me. As my professional network expanded, so did my access to obscure municipal financial data. Late one Thursday evening, while cross-referencing public land registries for a new client, I stumbled across a very strange, highly concerning financial anomaly connected directly to Mitchell Crest communities. It involved a massive, highly publicized riverfront development project the company had aggressively acquired 2 years ago. I dug much deeper, pulling the state tax filings for our family philanthropic foundation. The numbers on the screen made my stomach drop into my shoes. Mitchell Crest was quietly funneling millions of dollars from the tax-exempt charitable foundation into a series of opaque, newly formed holding companies. Those shell companies were then purchasing highly polluted, functionally worthless parcels of land along the riverfront parcels that required exorbitant, legally mandated toxic soil remediation before a single shovel could hit the dirt. My father was using the family charity as a secret, illegal slush fund to absorb the catastrophic environmental liabilities of his commercial projects, keeping the massive losses off the primary corporate balance sheet. It was a breathtakingly illegal maneuver. A fragile house of cards built entirely on toxic dirt and fraudulent tax returns. I could clearly see the shape of the massive crime, but I was missing the definitive internal corporate communications needed to tie the fraudulent cash transfers directly to Franklin's mahogany desk. Then, my mobile phone buzzed with a text message from a number I had not saved in my contacts. Though I knew exactly who it belonged to, it was my older brother, Grant. We had not spoken a single syllable to each other since the night of the disinheritance. His text message started with a cowardly, meandering pleasantry about the recent rainy weather, followed by vague, whining complaints about how stressful the upcoming fiscal quarter was shaping up to be at the corporate headquarters. Then, buried at the very bottom of the long, rambling message, came the true, terrifying purpose of his outreach. He asked, with painfully forced casualness, if I happened to still possess any of my old archival hard drives or legal files from my tenure as Risk Management Counsel. Every single alarm bell in my head began screaming simultaneously. Grant was the golden boy. He had unrestricted, executive access to the entire Mitchell Crest corporate server network. There was absolutely no legitimate business reason for him to be hunting for my outdated files unless he was desperately trying to locate something specific, something buried deep in the past that was suddenly becoming very dangerous in the present. He was looking for the exact same missing puzzle piece I was. The walls inside the empire were finally starting to crack. Before I could even formulate a strategic, cautious response to my brother's incredibly dangerous inquiry, my professional life surged forward, completely obliterating my family's desperate attempt to erase me from the map. The following morning, the senior director of Harrogate Advisory called me into his corner office. He was grinning broadly as he handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the official state seal. "You have been officially nominated for the Governor's Award for Ethical Urban Development, Aurora," the director said, his voice brimming with genuine pride. "The press release goes out to every major business publication in the state tomorrow morning." I stared down at my name printed in heavy gold ink. My father had orchestrated an elaborate, legally binding performance to strip me of the Mitchell legacy and banish me to the shadows. He wanted me invisible, but he had fundamentally miscalculated the trajectory of my career. The spotlight was swinging back around with blinding force, and this time, I was stepping directly into it entirely on my own terms, holding a lit match. The message arrived on a dreary Tuesday afternoon, casting a sudden, unwelcome shadow over my bright office at Harrogate Advisory. It was from my younger sister, Delaney. We had not exchanged a single syllable since the night I walked out of our family dining room. Now, just 3 weeks before her lavish, highly anticipated engagement party, she was urgently asking to meet. She specifically requested a rundown, anonymous diner on the county line, miles away from the manicured country clubs and the relentless, watchful eyes of my mother's elite social circle. I almost deleted the message, but the desperate, fractured tone of her text made me grab my heavy wool coat and walk out into the rain. When I slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite her, I barely recognized the woman sitting there. Delaney had always been the pristine, untroubled princess of the Mitchell household. She was forever shielded from the ugly, grinding mechanics of our father's business, living her entire life in a perpetual state of curated perfection. But that afternoon, the protective greenhouse glass had completely shattered. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled at the collar. There were dark, heavy shadows beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she gripped a thick ceramic coffee mug. She no longer looked like an heiress. She looked like an exhausted prisoner who had been holding her breath for a decade and was finally suffocating under the pressure. "I knew about the dinner," she whispered. The words hung in the greasy air between us, heavy, foul, and suffocating. I stared across the table at her, feeling my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. "You sat there and drank your expensive wine while he erased me from the world. He made us sign them. Aurora," she pleaded, her voice breaking into a wretched sob. "He forced us to sign side agreements." She proceeded to explain the sickening, calculated mechanics of Franklin's absolute control. A week before that formal dinner, he had summoned Grant and Delaney individually into his wood-paneled study. He presented them with legally binding documents guaranteeing their specific, massive percentages of the family trust and the immediate release of Delaney's extravagant wedding funds. But the money came with a brutal, non-negotiable condition. They had to remain entirely silent. They could not question his authority. They could not offer me a single word of support. And they had to formally agree with my expulsion. If they spoke out, or if they refused to sign, they would be stripped of everything, cast out exactly like I was about to be. I was terrified, she cried, hot tears spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her makeup. My wedding is costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The down payment on the new townhouse in New York is tied to the trust. I could not lose it. I just wanted to be safe. I looked at my weeping sister, and I felt a strange, cold mixture of pity and absolute, gut-wrenching disgust. Her confession was not a genuine plea for forgiveness. It was a desperate attempt to wash her own hands of the unbearable guilt. She had willingly sold her sister out for a floral arrangement budget and a piece of prime real estate. "Your safety is a complete illusion, Delaney," I told her quietly, my voice devoid of any comforting warmth. "He bought your loyalty with your own inheritance, and now he permanently owns your conscience. That is not financial security. That is a hostage situation." She wiped her wet face with a cheap paper napkin and took a long, shaky breath. "There is something else. Something you desperately need to know." Before Grandmother Edith passed away, she left a heavy steel lockbox with her private attorneys. She left strict, explicit instructions regarding its contents. The box was only to be given to you if you ever proved you could stand completely on your own 2 feet, without relying on a single dime of Mitchell money. My heart skipped a heavy beat. Grandmother Edith had been the only person in our bloodline who saw Franklin for exactly what he was. She had openly despised his ruthless tactics and his obsession with superficial power. "And Grant is not safe either," Delaney continued, her voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. "He is drowning. Aurora. He looks perfectly fine in the board meetings, but he has leveraged himself into massive, catastrophic personal debt through incredibly reckless speculative land deals. He is floating hundreds of thousands of dollars on high interest, short-term loans, living entirely on the desperate, pathetic assumption that Dad will eventually die and hand him the keys to the entire empire. If the parent company takes a major financial hit, Grant goes bankrupt instantly." It all made perfect sense now. Grant's frantic, transparent text message asking for my old risk management files was an act of pure desperation. "What kind of hit are we talking about?" I asked, leaning closer across the sticky table. "The riverfront," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the diner door. "The Glassmere Landing project. The internal compliance officers are completely panicking behind closed doors. There are rumors about the old industrial pollution. They are saying the soil was never properly remediated before the foundation was poured. Dad is aggressively pushing the city zoning board to approve the final residential permits this month. But if the environmental regulators find out what is actually buried down there, the entire development will be condemned." Glassmere Landing. The specific name echoed loudly in my mind. It was the exact same massive commercial project tied to the fraudulent charitable foundation transfers I had discovered in the public tax registries. I left Delaney crying softly in the diner booth. I did not offer her absolution. I could not forgive her, because her tears did not undo the profound betrayal of her silence. I drove straight back to the industrial depot. The heavy corrugated metal doors were open, and the sharp, clean smell of cut pine filled the chilly evening air. Wes was carefully wiping down his table saw with a rag. I walked right up to him and relayed everything Delaney had just confessed. I told him about the secret side agreements. I told him about Grandmother Edith's hidden lockbox. I told him about Grant's crippling hidden debts. Then, I said the name of the development. Glassmere Landing. Wes completely froze. The rag in his hand stopped moving. The easy, relaxed posture he always carried vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, rigid, terrifying tension. He looked at me, his dark eyes wide with shock. "Say that name again," he demanded quietly. "Glassmere Landing," I repeated, watching the color drain from his face. "The massive luxury residential development on the East River." He dropped the oily rag onto the sawdust-covered floor. He walked swiftly over to a heavy metal filing cabinet tucked into the far corner of his workshop. He pulled a heavy ring of brass keys from his pocket, unlocked the bottom drawer, and reached far into the back. He pulled out a battered, thick plastic storage container. He brought it over to the massive oak workbench and opened it directly under the bright, unforgiving glare of the halogen work light. "5 years ago," Wes said, his voice hard and steady, stripping away any trace of his usual warmth. "I took a short-term framing contract on a commercial site. It was long before Mitchell Crest officially bought the land. back when it was still held by a nameless subsidiary shell company. I was on that site for exactly 3 weeks. He reached into the plastic container and pulled out a thick stack of faded, glossy photographs and a handful of crinkled, carbon copy material invoices. He spread them out across the rough wood of the table. The photographs clearly showed massive, heavily rusted steel drums leaking thick, black, toxic sludge directly into the exposed, porous earth. The invoices detailed massive orders for cheap, completely unapproved chemical neutralizers instead of the legally mandated deep soil excavation and removal services. I took these pictures because the site supervisor explicitly ordered my crew to pour the concrete foundation directly over the contaminated soil, Wes explained, pointing a calloused finger at the undeniable, damning proof. When I told him it was a massive violation of federal environmental law and a lethal hazard to anyone living above it, he fired me on the spot. I kept the paperwork and the photos hidden away because I knew, deep in my gut, that something fundamentally evil was happening on that land, and I figured one day the truth would need a witness. I stared down at the scattered photographs, feeling the final, heavy piece of the puzzle lock violently into place. My father had not just orchestrated a cruel, theatrical family dinner to humiliate me over my choice of husband. That dinner was merely the visible tip of a massive, terrifying iceberg. It was a calculated, desperate legal maneuver designed to permanently neutralize his smartest, most capable child. The entire Mitchell empire was not built on visionary real estate development or exceptional business acumen. It was built entirely on a complex, rotting system of hush money, severe environmental crimes, and weaponized fear. He had successfully forced my siblings to sign their own souls away to protect his fraudulent, toxic empire. He had tried to crush my spirit and isolate me financially so I could not expose his crimes when the ground finally gave way. But as I looked at my husband, standing in the beautiful home we had built with our own bare hands, holding the exact, undeniable evidence needed to tear my father's legacy down to the studs, I realized Franklin Mitchell had made a fatal, arrogant error. He had not just kicked me out of his house. He had handed me the sledgehammer. 2 weeks after my sister wept in that roadside diner, my professional trajectory violently collided with my father's desperate cover-up. The county commissioners officially appointed me to chair the newly formed Regional Ethics Oversight Board. Our primary mandate was to rigorously review and audit all pending applications for massive public tax subsidies before a single cent of taxpayer money was released. Sitting directly at the very top of that towering stack of dockets, flagged for an urgent municipal grant of $30 million, was the Glassmere Landing riverfront development. The moment my appointment was published in the local business journal, my mobile phone rang. The caller identification displayed a private corporate line I had not seen in almost a year. My father did not offer a greeting when I answered. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply dictated a time and a location, expecting absolute compliance, just as he always had. We met at the Wellington Club on a freezing Thursday evening at 6 o'clock. It was the heavily guarded, ultra-exclusive private social club where the city's old money gathered to divide the region over expensive bourbon. It was also the exact place he used to bring me when I was just 12 years old. He used to sit me in the corner of the mahogany dining room and teach me how to read the subtle power dynamics of the room before I was ever allowed to read a legal contract. He taught me to spot the desperate men, the arrogant men, and the men who were quietly holding all the leverage. When I walked into the dimly lit, wood-paneled lounge, I read the room immediately. My father was sitting in a high-backed leather booth, and for the first time in his entire life, he looked like a man who was quietly bleeding out. He did not stand to greet me. He did not offer an apology for the brutal public disinheritance. He bypassed all human pleasantries and went straight into the transaction. He slid a thick, bound legal folder across the polished table. "The paperwork is fully executed on my end," Franklin stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth. "It immediately restores your name to the primary family trust. It legally transfers the deed of the lake house back into your name, free and clear of any liens. It also establishes an irrevocable cash transfer of $5 million into an account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. I looked down at the heavy leather folder, then back up at his face. And what exactly am I purchasing with $5 million and a vacation home? Dad, your immediate resignation from the Ethics Oversight Board, he replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of his scotch, followed by your signature on a comprehensive, ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding any and all internal operations of Mitchell Crest Communities. You take the money, you step down citing a sudden conflict of interest, and you walk away from the Glassmere Review. I leaned back against the leather booth. The bribe was breathtaking, but it proved Wes had been right all along. My father had staged that dinner to cut me off before Glassmere exploded. Now that I was sitting on the municipal board with the power to stop his bailout, he was cornered, and he was trying to buy me back. You went through an awful lot of theatrical trouble to kick me out of the dining room, I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly level. It seems rather counterproductive to buy me a new chair now. His jaw tightened, a brief flash of genuine irritation breaking through his icy facade. You made a fundamentally foolish emotional decision, Aurora. You aligned yourself with a man who has absolutely zero concept of what it takes to sustain an empire. Your husband is a manual laborer. He is a tradesman. He understands the simple mechanics of wood and stone. He does not possess the intellectual capacity to comprehend the immense, crushing weight of a legacy. I am offering you a final chance to correct your massive error and return to the winning side of the table. He used the polite, sophisticated vocabulary of the upper class, but the sentiment was pure, unadulterated poison. He was looking right at me, expecting the obedient daughter to take the bribe, protect the family name, and retreat to the shadows. Wes understands exactly what happens when you build a house on a toxic foundation, I replied coldly. I will not sign your agreement. I will not resign from the board. And I will not take a single dime of your dirty money. I stood up, leaving the unsigned contract sitting on the table, and walked out of the club. The cold night air felt incredibly clean against my face. The chess match was over. We were no longer playing for position. We were playing for blood. When I returned to the depot, the massive space was quiet. Wes was waiting for me at the heavy kitchen island in our loft. He did not ask how the meeting went. He could see the raw, focused adrenaline radiating from my posture. He walked over to the dining table and brought out the old plastic storage container he had opened a few weeks prior. We already had the damning photographs of the leaking chemical drums and the forged material invoices. But now, knowing the sheer scale of the financial fraud my father was attempting to cover up, we needed the undeniable corporate link. Wes dug past the photos and pulled out a thick stack of printed email chains. They were time-stamped correspondence from his brief, volatile stint on the Glassmere site 5 years ago. I kept these in my truck when I walked off the job, Wes explained, spreading the crinkled papers across the granite counter. These are the direct orders from the regional vice president of Mitchell Crest, explicitly commanding the site supervisors to ignore the toxic soil reports and pour the concrete anyway. They are copied directly to your father's executive office. It was the smoking gun. But a smoking gun was not enough to dismantle an entire corporate empire. I needed to prove the financial motive behind the environmental cover-up. The next morning, I called Tessa Boone. Tessa was my oldest friend from law school, and currently one of the most ruthless investigative forensic accountants in the state. She arrived at the depot carrying a heavily encrypted laptop and 3 massive thermoses of black coffee. We cleared the entire dining table and went to work. For 48 straight hours, Tess and I cross-referenced the time-stamped emails Wes had saved with the publicly available tax filings of the Mitchell Family Charitable Foundation. We tracked the dates of the environmental violations on the construction site and matched them against the sudden, massive transfers of cash moving through my father's newly formed shell companies. At 3 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. Tessa finally hit the bottom of the ledger. She spun her laptop around so I could see the highlighted columns. He is running a massive, illegal revolving credit scheme, Tessa said, her voice raspy from exhaustion. Mitchell Crest could not secure traditional bank financing for the Glassmere project because the land was secretly classified as a severe toxic hazard. So, your father used the family trust and the tax-exempt charitable foundation as a hidden financial cushion. He leveraged the charity's clean assets as collateral to secure high-interest, short-term shadow loans to keep the construction moving. If Glassmere Landing does not get that $30 million public subsidy approved by your ethics board next week, the development goes bankrupt. If the development goes bankrupt, the shadow lenders will instantly seize the family trust and the charity to cover the debt. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The entire empire was completely hollow. My father had risked the future of his own children, the legacy of my grandmother, and the safety of thousands of future residents, all to protect his own flawless image of absolute control. He expected me to act like a Mitchell. He expected me to take the settlement, protect the family wealth, and preserve my own comfortable future. But sitting there in the cold, beautiful home my husband and I had built with our own hands, looking at the irrefutable evidence of my father's absolute corruption, I made the final, pivotal decision. I was not going to fight him in private arbitration to reclaim my stolen inheritance. I was not going to negotiate for a seat at his rotting table. I was going to take all of this evidence, walk straight into the public hearing, and strip Franklin Mitchell of the only thing he had ever truly loved. I was going to take his control. The State Conservation Award ceremony happened on a crisp Tuesday morning. We did not just win the prize. The old freight depot became the celebrated crown jewel of the state's historical preservation initiative. A prominent local television network spent an entire week filming a long-form documentary about our meticulous restoration process. The broadcast aired on a Sunday evening, directly competing with the prime-time news cycle. On the screen, I sat at our reclaimed oak table, articulating the vital necessity of responsible, community-centric urban development. The camera then cut to Wes. He was standing in the cavernous workshop, his heavy hands gently wiping decades of industrial grime from a single, salvaged terracotta brick. He spoke with such quiet, profound reverence for the original builders and the honest labor of the past. The juxtaposition was absolutely devastating to the Mitchell Crest public relations machine. While my father spent millions of dollars on glossy, soulless television commercials promoting synthetic luxury built on environmentally disastrous land, Wes and I were offering the city something undeniably authentic. The public response was a massive avalanche of support. We were no longer just a disgraced daughter and a blue-collar contractor. We were a highly visible, highly credible symbol of ethical business. Franklin Mitchell was a man who survived entirely on controlling the narrative. And for the very first time in his life, the narrative was actively slipping through his fingers. He saw the exact same symbolic power he had hoarded for decades bleeding out into the public sphere. Industry whispers quickly turned into shouting. According to my former colleagues who still navigated those icy corporate hallways, my father had become terrifyingly erratic. The composed, calculating patriarch was gone, replaced by a volatile, desperate tyrant. He was firing senior vice presidents on a daily basis, screaming at his expensive legal teams, and pulling every corrupt political lever he possessed to circumvent my regional ethics oversight board. He sent high-priced lobbyists to pressure the county commissioners, but the newly ignited public spotlight from the documentary made it political suicide for anyone to grant Mitchell Crest a backdoor favor. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. The immense, crushing pressure of that trap fractured my older brother first. Grant called me late on a Thursday night. There was no meandering small talk, no cowardly evasion, and no pretense of corporate superiority. He sounded like a man standing on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff, looking down into the abyss. "You have to approve the Glassmere landing subsidies." "Aurora," Grant begged, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "I am entirely ruined if that project freezes." I leveraged my personal portfolio against the future returns of that specific development. "The shadow lenders are threatening to call in the debts by the end of the month. If the company goes down, they take my house, my accounts, my entire life." I listened to his frantic breathing through the receiver. He was not asking me to save the family legacy. He was begging me to save his own reckless skin. "I cannot protect you from the consequences of Dad's fraudulent ledgers, Grant," I told him evenly, feeling no satisfaction, only a deep, abiding sadness. "You tied your life raft to a sinking ship," he cursed at me, a wet, desperate sound, before slamming the phone down. Just 48 hours later, the second pillar of the perfect Mitchell family violently collapsed in full view of high society. My sister, Delaney, abruptly canceled her wedding. It was not a quiet, discreet postponement managed by a public relations firm. She sent out a mass email to 200 of the wealthiest families in the state, completely torching the event just 14 days before the massive ceremony. The ensuing scandal ripped through the country club circuit like wildfire. But the truth behind closed doors was far uglier than a simple change of heart. I learned the specific details through the tightly knit network of estate lawyers. Delaney had discovered that her polished, aristocratic fiancé was secretly meeting with our father. He had been providing Franklin with detailed, weekly reports of every single conversation Delaney and I had shared, trading his future wife's privacy for guaranteed, lucrative board seats and early, unrestricted access to her trust fund allocations. Delaney had lived her entire life terrified of upsetting the family ecosystem, but realizing she was about to marry a spy specifically hired to keep her on a leash, finally snapped her awake. She threw the massive diamond ring back at his face and walked out of her own penthouse, leaving the shattered illusion of the perfect family bleeding on the marble floor. The sheer velocity of the family's public unraveling proved too much for my mother, Celeste Mitchell, the woman who had spent 4 decades treating her social standing as a competitive blood sport. Simply stopped showing up. She quietly resigned from the charity gala committees she had ruthlessly governed for years. She stopped hosting the lavish Sunday dinners. Her prized box seats at the symphony remained entirely empty. According to the relentless society gossips, she had even begun attending intensive private therapy sessions 3 times a week. For my entire life, my mother had possessed the terrifying stamina to maintain the facade of a woman in absolute control, capable of smiling radiantly through any degree of domestic cruelty. Now, she no longer had the strength to put the heavy mask on. The silence radiating from her was not the calculated, punitive silence of the dining room execution. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of a woman who had finally hit the absolute bottom of her denial. Everything was converging upon a single, catastrophic point. Wes and I were sitting in the loft on a Tuesday morning, drinking black coffee and going over the final audit agenda for the upcoming ethics board hearing, when a courier knocked loudly on the heavy metal doors of the depot. He handed Wes a thick, unmarked manila envelope with absolutely no return address. Wes brought it upstairs and placed it carefully on the kitchen island. I sliced the heavy paper open with a pocket knife. Inside was a stack of highly classified, unreleased corporate documents. The first few pages were the official, unredacted meeting minutes from the Mitchell Family Trust Executive Board, specifically documenting the aggressive leveraging of the charitable funds. They explicitly confirmed every single financial theory Tessa and I had built. But it was the final document in the thick stack that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a legally binding amendment to the primary family trust, the exact document that officially authorized the massive transfer of Clean Foundation assets to the toxic shell companies managing the Glassmere site. The legal amendment required 2 signatures to be properly executed, my father's and my mother's. Franklin's signature was a bold, aggressive scrawl at the bottom of the page. Beside it was the signature of Celeste Mitchell. But attached to the back of the amendment was a separate sheet of paper containing 5 distinct, authenticated samples of my mother's actual handwriting from previous, unrelated legal filings. The discrepancy was glaringly obvious even to an untrained eye. The slant was entirely wrong. The pressure points on the ink were incredibly hesitant. The signature on the trust amendment authorizing the massive financial fraud was a complete, undeniable forgery. I stared down at the definitive proof of criminal fraud lying on my reclaimed wood table. Someone deep inside the fortified, paranoid walls of Mitchell Crest had meticulously gathered this highly guarded evidence, packaged it, and delivered it directly into my hands just days before the public hearing. Someone inside my old house had finally decided to choose a side. I just did not know who had sent it. I did not know if it was Grant, driven completely mad by his desperate, crushing debts and seeking revenge. I did not know if it was Delaney, finally awakened from her lifelong slumber and burning the house down on her way out. Or perhaps it was my mother, sitting in a sterile therapist's office, realizing she had been nothing more than a forged signature in my father's grand, destructive design. The Mitchell empire was sinking incredibly fast, and someone from the inside was deliberately handing me the heavy iron anchor. Exactly 3 days after the local network aired our documentary, a heavy, frantic knocking echoed from the ground floor of the depot. The rain was coming down in freezing, horizontal sheets, battering the old industrial windows. Wes was upstairs going over the final audit agenda, so I walked down the metal staircase to pull open the heavy corrugated doors. My mother stood under the rusted iron awning. For my entire existence, Celeste Mitchell had been a woman heavily armored in bespoke tailoring, immaculate hair, and a curated, impenetrable smile. The woman shivering on my loading dock was completely unrecognizable. She was not wearing her custom designer heels. She wore soaked, ruined leather flats. Her usually flawless mascara was running in dark, jagged lines down her pale cheeks. Her expensive trench coat was completely saturated with rain, but most startling of all, her arms were wrapped tightly around 2 massive, incredibly heavy cardboard banker boxes. "I sent the anonymous envelope, Aurora," my mother said. Her voice was completely stripped of its usual melodic, practiced tone. It was ragged and raw. But I realized a few copied pages were not going to be enough to stop him. "I brought the rest of the ledgers." I stood aside, too stunned to speak, and let her step into the dry warmth of the workshop. Wes came down the stairs, took the heavy, wet boxes from her shaking arms without a single word, and led us up to the loft. We sat at the reclaimed wood table. I did not offer her a cup of hot tea. She did not ask for a towel or a moment to compose herself. She did not cry for sympathy. She sat down, placed her wet hands flat on the wood, and began to dismantle her entire life. "Your father did not stage that dinner because he was offended by your marriage," Celeste stated flatly, looking directly into my eyes. His private wealth management advisors warned him exactly 4 weeks prior to that night. They told him that if you remained a named beneficiary within the primary inheritance structure, you possessed the undeniable legal standing to demand a forensic audit of the family foundation the absolute second the Glassmere crisis went public. I felt a cold, hard knot of validation tighten in my chest. Wes had been exactly right from the very beginning. He needed a compelling, highly public narrative, she continued, her voice gaining a steady, bitter strength. He needed you to look like the erratic, rebellious daughter who abandoned her prestigious family for a man we deemed entirely unsuitable. That way, when you inevitably tried to blow the whistle on his environmental crimes, he could dismiss your claims to the board and the press as a vindictive, emotionally unstable vendetta. He built a cage of paper and silence around you. And you sat at the head of the table and helped him lock the door, I replied, my tone deliberately devoid of forgiveness. "I did," she said, her chin dropping slightly. I have survived my entire adult life by simply avoiding the blast radius of his anger. I convinced myself that keeping my mouth shut was the only way to keep the family safe. I thought I was the peacekeeper. But when I accidentally discovered that amended trust document in his private study 2 weeks ago, when I saw my own forged signature actively authorizing the illegal transfer of millions of dollars to those toxic shell companies, the grand illusion finally shattered. I am not a respected partner in that marriage. I am just a legally binding pen he uses when he needs to write a massive lie. She reached into the top cardboard box and pulled out a heavy, dark metal lockbox. She placed it gently on the table and handed me a small brass key. "Your grandmother Edith left this with her private attorneys," Celeste explained. "They delivered it to me the day she died, with incredibly strict instructions. I was terrified to give it to you while you were still working for the firm. Entangled in his web, I hid it away." I took the key, my fingers trembling slightly, and unlocked the heavy lid. Inside rested a handwritten letter on thick, cream stationery and a formal, legally notarized codicil. I unfolded the heavy paper and read my grandmother's sharp, elegant script. The terms were brutally explicit and legally ironclad. If I possessed the sheer, unyielding strength to walk away from the Mitchell fortune without allowing money to buy my compliance, the expansive lake house and the absolute supervisory control of the family philanthropic foundation were to be immediately and irrevocably transferred to my name alone. Grandmother Edith knew her son was a monster, and she had built a hidden failsafe right into the bedrock of the family wealth. Waiting for the day, I finally woke up. "I filed formal separation papers this morning," Celeste announced, breaking the heavy silence in the loft. "I have already retained a highly aggressive litigation attorney. I am fully prepared to sign a sworn affidavit confirming the forgery on the trust documents, and I will testify in open court to his deliberate, financial coercion of your brother and sister." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "I know exactly what this means. Aurora, I know my social circle will completely banish me by tomorrow afternoon. I know the wealthy friends I spent 40 years meticulously cultivating will cross the street to avoid looking at me. I am going to lose absolutely everything I thought mattered, and I no longer care." Then, my mother turned her gaze toward Wes. He was leaning quietly against the kitchen counter, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a steady, unreadable expression. "Wes," Celeste said, her voice trembling but her posture rigidly straight. She did not look away from him. "I treated you like dirt on the bottom of my shoe. I looked at an honest, hard-working man, and I felt nothing but a vile, pathetic class contempt. I was utterly terrified of losing my elevated status among terrible people. And I was an absolute coward when I should have fiercely defended my own daughter's happiness. You built a real solid home for her when I allowed hers to be stolen. I was incredibly wrong about you, and I am profoundly sorry." The tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, hot and fast, but they were born of absolute, devastating truth. There was no cheap plea for absolution in her eyes, no subtle demand that we immediately welcome her back into our good graces. She was simply dropping the heavy stones she had been carrying for decades. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, finally seeing a flawed, broken, but undeniably real human being instead of a polished, corporate mannequin. "I hear you, Mother," I said, my voice firm, unwavering, and completely clear. "And I accept the files. I accept your testimony, but you need to understand the absolute, non-negotiable reality of what happens next." She nodded slowly, wiping her wet face with the back of her hand, waiting for my terms. "There will be absolutely no secret negotiations with his defense lawyers," I told her, leaning forward over the table. "We are not doing a quiet, in-house settlement to dissolve the marriage and protect your remaining assets. We are not going to lift a single finger to save the Mitchell public reputation. Every single document in these 2 boxes, every forged signature, And every illegal bank transfer is going straight into the public record at the Ethics Board hearing next week. He will be exposed in the bright, unforgiving light of day. I tapped my finger firmly against Grandmother Edith's handwritten codicil. And if this document holds up in probate court, if I actually take legal control of the family foundation and the recovered properties, none of that wealth is going back into the family vaults to rot. Every single dollar will be weaponized. I am going to use his hoarded money to build affordable housing, restore ruined neighborhoods, and support the exact people my father spent his entire life pushing out into the cold. I looked hard into her exhausted, tear-stained eyes. If you stand with me now, you stand in the absolute light. There is no going back to the country club. Are we entirely clear? Celeste Mitchell looked around the warm, vibrant loft we had built from absolute ruin. She looked at the man she had once despised, who was now holding the door open for her salvation. Finally, she looked back at me. She nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement. "Burn it all down, Aurora," she said quietly. The emergency joint session was convened on a cold Thursday morning in the Grand Municipal Hearing Room. It was an unprecedented gathering. The Regional Ethics Oversight Board sat at the elevated mahogany bench, flanked by the managing partners of the Family Trust and the primary executives of the commercial lending syndicate bankrolling Mitchell Crest. Franklin walked through the heavy double oak doors precisely at 9 o'clock. He wore his signature charcoal wool blazer. He carried himself with the supreme, terrifying confidence of a man who firmly believed that blood, money, and deeply ingrained fear would inevitably force everyone back into their designated places. He looked at me, sitting at the head of the Oversight Committee, with a faint, patronizing smirk. He thought I was finally there to negotiate. He assumed I was staging this public spectacle simply to leverage my way back into his will. I banged the wooden gavel once, the sharp crack echoing through the high ceilings. "Before we review the specific financial disclosures regarding Glassmere Landing," I announced, my voice amplified by the microphone, "I want to state for the official public record that I am permanently waiving any and all future claims to the Mitchell family primary inheritance. I do not want my name restored to your will. Franklin, I do not want a single cent of your personal fortune." The patronizing smirk vanished from his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks. By publicly refusing his money, I had completely neutralized his greatest psychological weapon. He had absolutely nothing left to dangle in front of me. I opened my heavy leather binder. I methodically submitted the first piece of evidence. This is a legally authenticated codicil, drafted by Edith Mitchell, explicitly overriding the current governance structure of the Family Philanthropic Foundation. Next, I pulled out the financial ledgers my mother had carried through the rain. These are the internal bank records demonstrating the illegal diversion of charitable funds into secondary shell companies. Alongside them is a forensic handwriting analysis, confirming that the secondary signature on the trust amendment authorizing these transfers is a complete forgery. I laid down the unredacted executive board minutes and a massive printed timeline. As you can clearly see, the timeline of this financial fraud aligns perfectly with a specific, orchestrated family dinner designed to forcibly remove me from any oversight capacity just weeks before the crisis escalated. Franklin opened his mouth to object, to unleash his booming, intimidating voice, but before he could speak a single word, Wes stepped up to the witness microphone. My husband did not wear a suit. He wore a clean, simple canvas work jacket. His deep voice resonated with a profound, unshakable calm that commanded the entire room. He did not attack my father personally. He simply laid out the cold, hard physical evidence. He presented the glossy, time-stamped photographs of the leaking chemical drums. He submitted the carbon copy material invoices proving the purchase of cheap, unapproved neutralizers. He handed the board the truncated internal emails explicitly ordering the concrete foundation to be poured directly over the highly toxic, untreated soil. Wes systematically stripped away the glossy, expensive marketing paint of the riverfront project, exposing the rotting, dangerous reality underneath. The silence in the municipal room was absolute and devastating. Then, the final, fatal blows came from entirely inside his own meticulously constructed house. My mother, Celeste, stood up from the gallery. She walked down the center aisle, her posture perfectly straight, and publicly signed a sworn legal affidavit confirming the forgery of her signature right in front of the municipal judge and the lending syndicate. Delaney stepped forward next. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were crystal clear. She submitted the brutal, coercive non-disclosure agreements our father had forced her to sign, publicly exposing the sick, transactional nature of his conditional love. Finally, Grant stood up. The golden boy was pale, sweating, and completely cornered, knowing his massive, speculative personal debts were about to be exposed by the collapsing corporate facade. He broke down completely. He confessed to the lending executives that Franklin had actively used their promised future inheritances as a heavy, choking leash to bind the entire family to his criminal cover-up. The resolution was swift and merciless. The ethics board immediately and permanently froze the $30 million public subsidy. Within 24 hours, the primary lending syndicate invoked the emergency breach clauses in their commercial contracts, officially stripping Franklin of all operational control over Mitchell Crest communities. The state attorney general placed the family trust under strict independent legal supervision pending a massive criminal investigation. The entire grand, intimidating structure of the Mitchell legacy was completely dismantled in a single afternoon. It was laid bare for the whole world to see not as a brilliant business empire, but as a pathetic, desperate machine built entirely on coercion and fear. But the final twist of the knife did not involve taking his empire for myself. In the weeks that followed, during the complex legal unwinding of the fraudulent assets, I enacted the terms of Grandmother Edith's codicil. I took legal possession of her sprawling lake house and the recovered, clean assets from the abused charitable foundation. I did not keep them. I formally negotiated the transfer of those assets to establish the Edith House Foundation. We immediately liquidated the expensive lake property. We used every single dollar to fund the meticulous restoration of affordable, multifamily housing and to provide substantial down payment assistance grants for first-time homebuyers. Specifically in the working-class neighborhoods, Mitchell Crest had spent decades trying to destroy. Franklin Mitchell managed to stay out of federal prison through incredibly expensive, aggressive legal maneuvering, but he lost the only thing he actually valued. His name remained bolted in heavy brass letters onto a few commercial buildings downtown, but he had absolutely no power left to command anyone. The legacy he had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to protect turned out to be nothing more than borrowed power, sustained only by the silence of the people he terrified. 6 months later, on a warm Sunday evening, the heavy corrugated metal doors of the old freight depot were thrown wide open to the cool night breeze. The massive, open-concept loft was filled with golden light and loud, genuine noise. I sat at the head of the massive reclaimed oak table, but I did not sit there to dominate the room or dictate the conversation. I sat there simply to welcome the people who actually deserved a seat. Wes was walking out of the open kitchen, carrying a massive steaming platter of roasted vegetables and perfectly seared flank steak, laughing his deep, resonant laugh at a joke a local architect had just made. My mother, Celeste, wearing comfortable linen pants and no makeup, was smiling warmly as she set down a large ceramic bowl of fresh salad. Across the table, Delaney was leaning back in her chair, laughing so hard she had to wipe away tears of actual joy, looking lighter and freer than she had in her entire life. Even Grant, currently navigating personal bankruptcy and working a humble entry-level accounting job across town, was sitting quietly near the end, looking exhausted but finally at peace. I looked around the table, taking in the beautiful, chaotic warmth of the home my husband and I had built with our own bare hands. I remembered that cold, terrifying night when my father pulled that folded piece of paper from his blazer pocket. He had read his will out loud specifically to erase me from his dining table, to cast me out into the dark. But looking at the vibrant, honest family gathered around me, I finally understood the profound irony of his grand design. I was not the one who had been banished. He had locked himself outside the only true home we ever had, and he threw away the key. Thank you so much for listening to this story to the very end. And please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.